Well, a very warm welcome to those of you that are joining us this morning, this afternoon, wherever you might be in the world. It's wonderful to have you here to have this discussion about climate change on boards. My name is Emily Farnworth. I'm co-director at the Centre for Climate Engagement at Hughes Hall, and I'm going to be hosting the session this morning. Just a couple of things as we get started and as we let participants join. You'll see that we have an illustrator. We have Tom illustrating the conversation today. You'll see that as part of your screen, and you can slide, hi Tom, you can slide around the screens just so that you can see everybody clearly and see the illustration clearly, and just want to give you that tip as we go through the conversation today. It's an exciting panel and an exciting conversation that we have here today. Just to give you a bit of context, so the Centre at Hughes Hall is part of the Bridge Initiative, and what we aim to do is to bridge between the evidence that we get from the academic community and bring this into the boardroom so that we can activate boards and companies to help accelerate climate action. And it's exciting today because what we have for you as part of the panel is different influences and different voices from across generations who are going to be sharing their thoughts and experience and knowledge about how they are either directly involved in what's happening in the boardroom currently of businesses globally, and also kind of what they see coming and what they would like to see into the future. So I'm going to introduce the panelists. So Helen Mayhe, who's the chair of the Renewables Infrastructure Group, is going to be really kind of giving us a wealth of experience of her actual direct involvement in boards. So welcome, Helen. We have Herman Betten, who's the Senior Director for Strategic Partnerships and Engagement for Royal DSM. And Herman has had a lot of experience working very closely with his board in DSM, particularly tackling climate change. We have Dr. Emily Webster, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Hughes Hall, particularly focused on climate law and how it relates to duty of care for board directors. And we have Ismael, who's currently studying a PhD based at Hughes Hall. So welcome to all of you. It's just a delight to have you all on the panel here today. I'm going to just kick off and just introduce you all, let yourselves really introduce yourselves in a little bit more detail, and just to ask, in your own words, how would you sort of describe your experience so far with this topic around board engagement around climate change? And maybe just if you could introduce yourselves and talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing. So I'll turn first to Ismail.
Hi everyone, hi. My name is Ismael. I'm a third year PhD student at Hughes Hall, researching new two-dimensional materials for energy storage solutions. Before Cambridge, I completed a master's in physics at Manchester and studied abroad at Berkeley. So alongside my research, I've experienced sustainability, working with the NHS Cambridgeshire hospitals to develop their sustainability policy. I've helped review and analyze TCFDs of South African banks, and recently developing guardrails for the Universal Ownership Summit for the largest asset owners globally for COP26.
Thank you, Ismail. Now, Emily.
Hi, so my name's Emily Webster, and as Emily said, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Hughes Hall focusing on climate change in companies. And my research and my doctoral research really focuses on how companies, how very polluting companies are regulated in response to climate change, and the effectiveness of this regulation. And I'm particularly interested in how legal regimes and regulatory regimes interact, particularly when they form barriers and clash, and perhaps don't have this holistic approach to regulating commercial activity that we would like and that is necessary in response to kind of such huge problems such as climate change that require really rapid action, which potentially regulatory regimes at the moment are not facilitating particularly well.
Thanks, Emily. And Herman, a quick introduction from you.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Herman. I have been at Royal DSM for the past 14 years now. It was originally intended a 3-month temporary assignment, but it slightly got out of hand. For me, so I always thought that I ended up, when I joined DSM and I was starting to work on climate, I always thought to myself that was by accident, really, and only fairly recently I kind of figured out that I've been working on climate and reading about it and engaged about it pretty much all my life. It started with the Club of Rome book, Limits to Growth, that was on my parents' coffee table. And I remember reading through it pretty much every day, looking at all these graphs about the future and really wondering about how you know, we would turn out. And for me, it's much more a sense of, I don't know, duty and you know, kind of pushing internally as a change agent to get it higher on the agenda. When I joined DSM in 2007, our head of sustainability, there was not an executive position. Our managing board was completely male and all from 3 countries, Netherlands, Germany, and Austria. That was it. And our supervisory board was mostly Dutch and never had a conversation about climate and sustainability. And together with our now former CEO, we started changing that. And it kind of grew from there to where we are today, but can talk more about that later. I don't want to keep up too much. Thanks.
No, thanks, Herman. It's really interesting to sort of reflect on when you first started thinking about this. And Helen, I know you've had all sorts of experience. I don't know what it is that you'd like to bring to this introduction, but over to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm Helen. I chair the Renewables Infrastructure Group, which is a FTSE 250 investment company, the largest green investment company with a market cap now of 3 billion. We own 80 different renewable sites in wind and solar around Northern Europe. I also sit on the board of SSE, which is one of the large energy suppliers, and I chair the Safety and Sustainability Committee there. I'm an Equality and Human Rights Commissioner, so you will perhaps understand that the S in ESG is quite important to me. I also sit on the board of an international law firm. I was General Counsel of National Grid PLC for 11 years before I retired, and now have a plural career. So that's me.
Wow, what a privilege to be able to guide this conversation today. Incredible experience across the board. Or I probably shouldn't use that word in that context, should I, given the conversation today. Just to dive in then to the conversation, and I'm going to turn it first to you, Ismail. As a student at Hughes Hall, what are some of the questions that you're asking and that your peers are asking about climate change, and in the context of sort of expectations, if you like, from the way boards are making decisions about companies around the world? It'd be good to just hear your reflections.
Thank you, Emily, for the question. So I guess everything that we're doing in our lives to make ourselves easier, safer, more comfortable is making things worse for the planet. The food we eat, the clothes we wear, the gadgets we use, and the way we move around. And while we know about some of the major polluters like beef, cars, and planes, many other major polluters like landfills, which contribute the same as planes, energy used in homes is about the same as cars, and cement in construction to that of food, are not really spoken about. And some of the questions typically asked today, such as what actions can we take and are these actions enough, don't feel as simple as they used to be. With so many recent studies and findings, some of these questions have become a bit more clear. We know what activities contribute negatively, and we know how to individually fix parts of the problem. So more complex questions are being asked about the way all these factors fit together. And it's not as easy as just cutting beef, cars, planes. The younger generation know that the problem of climate change is not as a simple fix of a few issues, but a change in lifestyle, to our way of living, to create a more complete circular solution. And as an aside, we know that individual change is simply not enough, and that we need buy-in from larger corporations globally for a unified response. And so there are many lifestyle questions or themes that we wonder about. The first topic is cost. So students already face heavy debt from studies, affordable house prices are out of our reach, and just this last week, the price of energy has shot up. So the future looks more and more expensive to live in a climate variable world. And living comfortably in such a world requires money. More money is needed to live sustainably and afford a new electric car, shop at a zero waste food store, and buy sustainable clothes. And there's no doubt that emissions versus wealth is a huge grey area, but generally the more money you have, it leads to life and consumption, travel, food, not necessarily, but typically. And so the first question asked is, how can we live comfortably with little impact? The next topic or theme is careers. So to have the money, we need an income, a job, and with any changing environment, of course, there's some element of opportunity. And if I scroll on LinkedIn, then the majority of graduate or entry-level jobs will mention the word sustainable or climate. And companies are tailoring this appeal to their audience, and they're right. Many students will have sustainability, as well as other societal and ecological topics through technology, policy, economy on their mind when searching for a job. So the second question is, how can we make an impact for our lives through our jobs? And the final topic I'll talk about is investment. So with a career, of course, comes a pension, and many of us starting careers will be thinking about, where do we put our pension towards? And it can be a difficult question, and quite a heavy one, since typically a person's pension will be their main investment. And investments, as we know, can have a very large impact. UK banks and investors were responsible for nearly double the UK's annual carbon emissions. So it's a lot. But a company's ethical fund might not be what you had in mind, and it might not be focused on environmental issues, which complicates things. For example, a fellow young professional, she was looking at her workplace pension scheme called Nest, which has a fund named BMO Responsible Global Equity Fund, where the top companies are Microsoft, Apple, MasterCard. This doesn't mean that the fund is wrong or unethical or deliberately misleading, but there's confusion that sustainable funds only hold companies whose main business is sustainability. And so the last question that we ask is, where do we put our investments? What do we invest in? And a lot of times the issue of climate change feels very out of hand for students and for the younger generation. There are so many aspects and problems while the responsibility is given to us. However, more and more, and rightly so, we're asking, what are others, what are they doing, or what should they be doing? And the perception among younger people is plain and simple that the governments and corporate boards in large institutions around the world are just not doing enough, acting quick enough, and there isn't any accountability or reparations for the damage already caused. And I think it's important for boards to know that the younger generation, they're going to be the future investors, the future shareholders, and now more than ever, we judge corporations on people and planets rather than profits, and if their promises are delivered.
Thank you, Ismail. Really kind of clear a whole range of things there. And I think that kind of tension between, a comfortable lifestyle and one that's, sort of minimizing impact, I think is a huge conundrum. And I guess ultimately, many businesses do have, have control over making that possible. Emily, I'm going to turn to you next. And given everything that Ismail has said, where do you see the role of regulation, and kind of what role in the future perhaps do you see that playing to tackle some of these challenges?
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, I think the role of regulation is hugely important to address corporate contribution to climate change. And I think up until this point, there's been a really kind of incremental steps towards creating a regulatory environment, and particularly for boards in particular, kind of focusing on disclosure, information disclosure, and procedural requirements rather than substantive obligations. And there's been more focus on kind of voluntary action or relying on markets to change behavior. And this works to some extent. So, market pressure has, increased vegan products. It's changed kind of plastics in packaging, but it just doesn't happen quickly enough or at enough scale. Whereas regulation, if it's done properly, and that's, there's a massive if there, can capture all the actors necessary who perhaps wouldn't necessarily take voluntary action or wouldn't be pressured by the market in the same way as other companies that are more kind of climate aware. And so regulation can really offer kind of a minimum standard or minimum obligations and responsibilities to then capture those actors that perhaps wouldn't necessarily be, as I said, swayed into voluntary action. And I think at the moment, there's real uncertainty about whether there are legal obligations and responsibilities for boards, or if there are barriers to boards taking climate action. For example, if the shareholders maybe wouldn't necessarily want a kind of stringent climate action, although as we've seen in some cases, it's investors that are pushing boards to do more. So it's a two-way street here. So I think regulation is needed for clarity. So to clear up what responsibilities and obligations there are or should be, and to remove obstacles for boards that are making decisions in relation to taking action in response to climate change, and to require unwilling boards to act. But on the other hand, it's really important that any interventions are clear and consistent, because if we go in, heavy-handed with the regulation, it can end up actually creating more barriers to action, more complexity in an area that's already very complex, because there are so many different types of environmental regulations that affect commercial activity, and so can actually create barriers instead of actually ensuring that there is an environment that's conducive to boards taking action in response to climate change. And so a really vital part of this is to ensure that all regulation that addresses a company's environmental impacts actually are consistent with each other, and that are viewed as a whole regulatory environment, as opposed to siloed approaches which don't necessarily have fulfill the objective of the regulation in question. So it's a balancing act, and it needs to be done very carefully. But I think the future really, for climate change to be addressed and for us to reach net zero by 2050, regulation is a really vital element to achieve this, and to ensure that companies and boards in particular are empowered to take climate action, as opposed to feeling perhaps like they don't know what action can actually be taken in the circumstances.
Thanks, Emily. And I think that sort of sense of, sort of waiting for companies to take voluntary action is just not going to kind of, get us to where we need to get to. And sort of this use of regulatory tools to sort of really drive sort of the basics, I suppose, across the entire economy is really critical. And maybe, Herman, that's a good thing to sort of, to bridge over to you. I mean, obviously working with the business community on a lot of voluntary action when there hasn't been necessarily, where it has relied on a small leadership group to move forward. What would you say that you've sort of observed over the course of your career, and the way that boards are reacting to climate change, and where do you think it's going to need, a further push to really accelerate things?
Well, that's a very easy question to answer. Where can I begin? I think first off, look, companies are, at a certain moment in time, we as a society, we started to believe that companies are there to make money, that is the goal of a company. And we started then developing all these wonderful management theories about optimizing our silos and going for the lowest cost possible, and squeezing out our suppliers and whatnot. And effectively, we made it worse. We created this take, make, dispose society, because it's cheaper to buy something, to use it, and then get rid of it. If it's broken, it's too expensive to have it fixed. And as a result, we came into this spiral of, perpetual, eternal growth that we think is logical. But in fact, we start now seeing that that is not logical, and that in fact, we are doing it completely wrong. And we should take our inspiration a little bit more from nature, where everything is circular. But we humans, of course, we thought we were smarter. The problem is now we're reaching this point that, most probably we already passed a number of tipping points that cannot be reversed, which, creates it worse and worse. And yeah, what then happens is that you have a group of companies that instead of delaying action, indeed steps up. We've done it within the World Economic Forum with the Alliance of CEO Climate Leaders, that we send this signal to policymakers, hey, we want action. I mean, for decades, you guys thought that business didn't want action because their purpose was supposedly to make money, but we actually do want action. And oh, by the way, we don't really see making money as the goal for a company. It's simply a means for a company to achieve a goal of, what you actually want to do. If you work in marketing, you call that purpose these days, but it's simply what your company is put on the planet to do, which is not to make money, but to make a certain product or service that makes people's lives better. Now, within that whole framework, yeah, voluntary action can go a long way, but it doesn't go all the way, because there's still a huge group out there that doesn't take action. And voluntary only works to get, let's say, a group going, and it would be good if policymakers then also recognize this and look at these actions and try to indeed do that through laws, through regulation. But there needs to be a certain amount of push, because right now we are not on track to reduce our emissions by 2030, let alone 2050. So we really need to step up. And I think now is also the time that boards have responsibility to their employees, to other stakeholders of the company, to take climate a little bit more seriously, and not only look at it as an energy transition, as we did maybe a decade ago, or risk management, which we maybe did 5 years ago, but now it's really all about the survival of our society, our economy, and the people that work for us and that we supply. Sorry to be such a doomsayer, but
no, it's interesting to sort of have that observation of sort of how you've seen things evolve. And Helen, I mean, I guess, as someone who's been in the boardroom through, through some of these sort of really sort of tricky times to navigate voluntary action and to push governments to do more. I mean, sort of what's your experience of what boards need to kind of help them accelerate?
Well, I think, take the example of TRIG Renewables Infrastructure Group, which I chair. We launched just over 8 years ago. Why did people invest in us then? Well, because we were paying a good dividend. We were doing a yield of over 5%, and in low interest rate times, that's what people were investing for us. That has now changed over these 8 years. When I used to see shareholders 6 or 7 years ago, they didn't really ask me much about the environment or social or governance or sustainability. They were very much still focusing on the returns. That has completely changed now. We get a lot of funds investing in us, be they managing money for high net worth individuals or pension funds, because we have strong environmental, social and governance credentials. I like to think of it as sustainability. Because it's not just profits, it's people and planet as well. All are important and all work together and should be able to work together in harmony. So, and I make no apologies for making profits, because then I can assure you, if I cut my dividend in half, my shareholders would leave me in droves and go somewhere else. I mean, they may come in because of the environmental credentials, but they certainly also come in because they're going to make some money out of the stock. What I think has also changed in the last 3 or 4 years, particularly probably in the last 2 years, there's been an increased focus on the environment. We're 100% green energy, so it's a really easy story for us. We create enough energy to power 1.5 million homes in Europe. It's very positive. We have very good governance. We have a very diverse board. It's always been 50-50 male, female, or for quite a time it was majority female, actually, which is unusual. We probably paid less attention to the social side, but COVID has really changed that. People, it matters how you treat people, whether it's people in the communities where we build our wind farms, for example, or how we treat our staff. That's become a huge focus as well. So I see no problem with the profit element, as long as it's in a sustainable way and it takes account of the people and the planet. And the three can work very well together, I think, and be a very powerful combination.
Thank you, Helen. It's really interesting to sort of, just to kind of get your perspectives on seeing how everything's changed. And maybe to sort of open up this discussion to all of you. Now we've heard for your different sort of experiences, I guess, or thoughts on what needs to be done. The IPCC report presented some very strong evidence earlier this year in terms of understanding a little bit more about how urgent this problem is. What do you think is, maybe just to give your perspectives, how do these kinds of scientific reports, do they change anything for, the sort of, I mean, guess, Ismael, from your perspective, in the context of the conversation that's happening, so the regulator, does it help regulators in any way? And how are boards sort of responding? Is it just another thing that they have to think about, or are they actually kind of really taking this to heart and sort of understanding some of the science? I don't know, just to open up the floor. I don't know which one of you wants to maybe jump in first on that one.
Why not? Yeah, I think for the younger generation, the IPCC results were pretty dire. I think, doesn't seem to be loads of hope for the future. And I think a lot of the feeling with fellow students is a bit of helplessness. I think there is some acceptance of the fact that there is irreversible change, and there's just general feeling that it's a bit too late. So I think a lot of what the younger people are feeling is, I think it's dubbed eco-anxiety. Just makes you feel a bit tired by all of it. But the results, it should make us reevaluate the importance of climate change in our decisions. But if we look at, for example, take the S&P companies, like in their most recent earnings, only about 130 out of the 500 cohort actually reference ESG. And I think, it's a massive hurdle just getting this name to the board, let alone comprehensive carbon footprint reporting, contingency measures, or whatever like mitigation efforts are in place. And in my experience, in helping the NHS with the sustainability policy, when I was interviewing several NHS trusts around the UK, it was clear that those trusts which were more mature in their strategies were those who were backed by their chief executives of that trust. And they would plain and simply say that their plans are more developed because they have the backing of their chief executive, which really speaks about the influence of the execs and board members that they have, that is felt throughout the company. And I think bottom line, the younger generation is just not seeing the leadership and accountability needed, and that the board, we feel need to be held accountable. And what we say when we say that is we're looking for a type of accountability. For example, there was this lawyer who beat Dutch Shell and argued that any company which ignores the consequences of 1.5 degrees C is deemed so consciously, and that companies they have a clear and duty of care for the healthy environment for all of world's citizens. So it was ruled that they must cut their gas emissions by 45% by 2030. So this is sort of like accountability that I think we're looking for, especially with the results come out now.
Thank you, Ismail. In terms of that sort of accountability, I don't know if Herman or Helen, you want to just respond.
Yeah, sure. So I think I think I'm lucky because I live in the Netherlands and I work for a Netherlands-based company, because in the Dutch corporate governance, we have already the duty to take care for all stakeholders, not just shareholders, but all stakeholders. So as a company, you can actually, someone can just go to court and say a company is not fulfilling its duty to all stakeholders. There's even a special court in Amsterdam, which is a company's court, where any stakeholder can go and start cases against the company. Now, that puts an extra burden, I think, on the shoulders, not just of directors, but also of the CEO and the executives, to look at more than just shareholders, recognizing what Helen also said, you know, although maybe money should not be the goal, but money is needed to deliver on the other matrices. And in the case of Shell, for instance, I think there was a clear case here in the Netherlands where the judge simply said, yeah, you have a fiduciary duty to take care of all stakeholders, even those who are not alive yet today, because the decisions that you make as a company can affect, of course, multiple generations. And as such, I think it's encouraging to see. At the same time, I think it's a shame that, you know, we need to go to court to get action done, because also in the Netherlands, the government now has been forced by the court to reduce their carbon emission as a country faster because they were not delivering. And that's actually a failure from public policy. I mean, if citizens have to go to court to actually demand that things are being done, then yeah, there's a systemic issue here. Yeah,
thanks, Herman. And Helen, I'll come to you next, but I'm just maybe wanting to sort of get Emily's reflections on that sort of the legal aspects of this, and any other thoughts from you on that process.
Well, so I mean, I think the IPCC and scientific evidence has been really so important in pushing action along and offering, you know, so taking the Shell case, is also another case in Australia against the Environment Minister, where this evidence is being used to demonstrate why action needs to be taken, and kind of overcome arguments such as, oh, we're only, you know, contributing a small amount of greenhouse gases, and you know, whereas in the past this is an argument that has been very successful in litigation cases, particularly in the US. We're starting to see this evidence come along that says, well, no, that's just not sufficient. You know, that you can't, we need to get to net zero or beyond, potentially beyond. And this is the evidence to show it. And I think that has been really important to see this mobilization of activity from non-state actors, and has helped, I think, to facilitate, for example, net zero for companies. You know, it's a justification for action, and it's overwhelming, really. And the recent IPCC report, however terrifying it has been, and they are terrifying, alongside, you know, the other evidence, scientific evidence out there regarding tipping points, as Herman was talking about earlier, it gives a legal basis for some of these cases to pursue accountability mechanisms, and it also offers non-state actors a very big justification to act, and also puts pressure on policymakers. So I think on multiple levels, it's really been really important to have this scientific research that is overwhelmingly, you know, demonstrating that there is a problem and we need to take action very quickly. And also, you know, through the UN FCCC mechanism or regime as a whole, it's been a really important coordinator for this activity and non-state action. So I think overall it's been very helpful, and particularly when it comes to companies really, you know, entering into groups such as We Mean Business, and pursuing this net zero by 2050 kind of ambition. So I think it's been very, very helpful.
And Helen, you know, just to either the combination of the sort of scientific evidence or some of this increasing pressure now of kind of using these regulatory tools to sort of you know, to kind of bring companies into courts. I mean, these things, how are they affecting the conversation in the boardroom?
Well, I think that if we come back to basics, if you're on the board of a listed company, so you can buy shares are readily traded in the UK, your primary duty is to your shareholders to look after shareholder interests. But under the Companies Act, Section 172, you have to have due regard to all stakeholders. So that includes, you know, people in communities, employees, etc. So that, I mean, that's the basic legal requirement. When it comes to things such as environmental and climate change, there is increasingly more regulation. And I think we have to be a little bit careful about this because companies can sometimes feel overloaded. We have, for example, the one that everybody's worrying about at the moment is TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. TRIG and also SSE, where I sit on the board, we're early adopters. We're already reporting on that. And I don't think we have to report till 2023, but maybe next year. So that's quite complicated. It's very financially orientated and it's very detailed. But there's all sorts of other reporting as well, a huge amount of it. So wearing my Equality and Human Rights Commission, and this is part of the S of ESG, there's gender pay gap reporting. We are the regulator for that. Now that has been suspended during the pandemic, but businesses that have more than 150 employees will have to report again in October. There's a huge amount of regulation under the ESG banner. It's getting more and more. Companies, I think, can find this a bit confusing on occasions, and also investors find it confusing. And they say, well, how do we really know a company has strong ESG credentials? So there are various other bodies out there that are starting to evaluate them. And so you can report against a whole load of different independent company metrics. And there are a lot of them. And they're all a bit different, and none of them is completely the gold standard. Some may say they are. And so we really wrestle with this. And there's more and more coming. So I think I hear what's said about regulation of companies in climate change. And yes, it is important, but it has to be meaningful regulation because just putting a load more regulatory obligations onto companies increases the cost. And does it really give a benefit at the other end? I think we have to be very careful about that. And at the moment, there's an awful lot out there and more coming, and companies are feeling a little bit swamped by it all when they want to do the right thing and be fully sustainable, but the reporting of it all can sometimes be rather difficult.
Just to stay with you for a moment, Helen, I mean, it sounds like, you know, we want this accountability. There are several tools. It's all very confusing. So what else would be helpful? Whether that's something that, you know, what tools could help to sort of really accelerate change for businesses that could be a bit more effective than some of the things that we have currently in place, do you think?
Well, for listed companies in the UK, we follow the combined code, we call it the Financial Reporting Council's combined code, and that constantly is being updated. It's been updated recently for best practice to have a certain number of women on boards, etc. We're looking at ethnic minorities on boards. That is the gold standard to which we all apply. Now, that doesn't really have detailed metrics in it at the moment about ESG reporting. I feel very loath to say it should do because, you know, you don't want to ask for something that's going to be make life more difficult. But in some ways, it would be helpful if the one regulatory body that people do follow and shareholders do follow in the UK gave a bit more guidance on this, because there is a lot of people, to be honest, making a lot of money out of reporting on companies and how they do with their sustainability, and they're probably making the money, and companies actually aren't getting necessarily the benefit out of it, nor are investors. So we have to be a little bit careful here. Because, you know, there's a bit of a carrot and stick approach, and regulation is fine on the stick, but one needs a bit of a carrot too, in my view.
Yeah, that's really helpful insight. In terms of sort of, are there other tools that governments should be using? We've talked a little bit about some of the regulation, but are there other things, you know, that governments should be doing to sort of step in and help to speed things up? I don't know, Ismail, maybe we can, maybe if you can kick us off. Okay,
I can add something. It builds a little bit on what Helen said. I think a fairly easy, I mean, look, you can make everything as complicated as you want, and usually complication means that you know, you delay action. But on ESG reporting in particular, I think governments, and I'm looking here at global governance, can really take a step forward by pushing towards a globally recognized, harmonized framework for non-financial reporting, because that is what we desperately need. There are now over 1,500 different sustainability matrices around. Most of them provide, indeed, as Helen said, a wonderful business model to those who make them, but they don't serve the purpose, which is, as investors, and all of us, we're investors. If you put money in a pension fund, you're also an investor. If you save in a bank, you're also an investor. Investors need to be able to compare apples to apples. And as long as we have sustainability matrices out there that are basically a PR show, there's not a lot of urgency for companies to change. But the moment investors can see what company X is doing versus company Y, and then can decide, is the money of my investors, of my pension holders, that all have a long-term horizon, by definition we are long-term investors, is it worth to putting it to company X or company Y? And then you will see rapid change. And it's a fairly simple thing for governments to do. So instead that the European Commission says, oh, we want to go for a separate system in Europe, the SEC is working on a separate system in North America, that defeats that purpose. So we really have to urge all policymakers to strive for that, because I'm not saying it's a silver bullet or whatever, but it will create pressure to companies where it hurts, which is money, investor money in particular, because a lot of companies are listed and flows of investor money are important, and a global harmonized framework for non-financial reporting will do just that.
Thank you, Herman. And Helen, I think you wanted to come in here as well.
Yes, if I may, I've been reading the chat. Crikey, you're a demanding audience, you lot. I've never seen something. I'm quite scared about it. But answering two comments and one question that was asked. And somebody said, could we be more specific? Well, I will give you a specific example of how you can get the ESG really embedded in a particular company metric. Now, we have a revolving credit facility at Trig. It's up to £500 million, so it means that we can borrow quickly to go and buy new assets, and then we raise our money from shareholders to pay off that loan. So that has ESG metrics in it. So we will incur a premium or a reduction in what we pay to our lending banks based on 3 sustainable targets. So one is environmental, increasing the number of homes we power with clean energy. The social one is increasing the amount of community funds that we give, and the governance is maintaining a low accident frequency rate. So we have the ESG KPIs built into our financial modelling. You can't get more embedded than that. We've actually just done the same for our currency hedging as well, or a similar facility. Somebody also raised the question of SDGs. Can't we relate to that? Yes, most companies do. And if you look at the Trig annual report, you will see we pick out 4 or 5 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we report our sustainability metrics against them. A lot of companies use those. So I hope I've answered that question. Look at the Trig sustainability report and you'll see exactly what we do. Thanks.
It sounds like it's a good model for others to be following. Just one final question from me, and then I will also kind of pull some from the audience. So thank you for those who've put forward some questions so far. But just one final ask. We've talked a lot about what companies have to do and what governments need to do. But obviously, you know, all businesses are made up of individuals, and all kind of individuals have got purchasing power, as we've heard. So what is it that we all individually need to be doing more of, whether that's, you know, in terms of sort of our own activities at home, or, you know, the leadership role and the agency that we have in our day-to-day lives? What advice would you give to each other?
I guess I'll come in on that one. I think it's really difficult. Because we live in a world that has vast supply chains and hidden emissions and hidden environmental damage. So knowing how you as an individual can make a difference, I think is really, really difficult. But I think it as you mentioned, Emily, you know, consumer power is it can be quite powerful, but it requires people to act together. As opposed to acting as individuals. And I think we have an opportunity to demand specific, you know, companies to take specific measures such as net zero ambitions, and use our purchasing power as a way to support that. Having said that, you know, Amazon, for example, leads a group talking about kind of net zero by 2050, whether or not, you know, it's also good on other areas, or is actually going to reach that ambition, is something that you can't, as an individual, actually validate. We don't have the information. So I think it's very difficult. So I suppose it's a bit gloomy outlook, but I think individuals have quite limited power, but we can mobilize what we have. And perhaps the biggest power we have is through voting, I suppose, and voting for politicians that actually take climate change seriously and don't pay lip service. And I think a really good example of that at the moment is we have, in the run up to COP26, a lot of talk about climate change and ambition, and the British Prime Minister going abroad and making big statements while at home still offering permits to oil and gas exploration, and actually the Chancellor not putting the money in that is necessary, because the money is really important to finance this green transition. And so I would say that perhaps maybe, as voters, we have the most power, and holding politicians to account that when they say they're going to do something, they actually do it. So I think that would be mine.
So consumers, using your consumer power and using your voting power, I think they're both extremely important aspects. I don't know if there's anything else folks want to bring into this part of the conversation.
Well, it's also about, to add, about accountability and about, well, I hate the buzzword, but walking the talk. So for instance, also have conversations if you work in a company or in your team, like about the behavior you do on behalf of that company. For instance, when I travel to Glasgow for COP26, I'm going to take the train. I know it's not going to be pleasant, because I have to take, I think, 3 or 4 trains and, have an overnight in London, but it somehow doesn't feel good to fly to a climate summit. It's a little bit weird. And there are other ways also that you can drive change. Most of our employee climate activities have been done as grassroots. It was not corporate that said, hey guys, you need to do that. Our push, and really push, on renewable electricity came from within, that people started pushing. And that is what you need. And for that, you also need, when you work at companies, to hire the people that you want to hire. And then, because I saw indeed the chat, one concrete example, let me give that quickly. Over a decade ago, we made half of our executive remuneration, and right now it's for all DSM employees, dependent on us meeting people and planet targets around safety, around carbon emission reduction, around employee engagement, and a whole range more. And when you connect that, you suddenly start seeing a change with people, but it also attracts the people that you want to have. And with that, you can get this change, and you can do that in your private lives, I think, as well.
Thank you, Herman. Well, I have some wonderful colleagues who are working behind the scenes to summarize some of the questions that have been coming through on the chat. And actually, there's one of the first ones is a really good build on what you just said, Herman, which is this point around incentives. Do we need more incentives in order to in order to drive the change that we want? And obviously, in the context of remuneration or bonuses, in the context of a corporate sort of setting, that's really important. But maybe to turn to you, Helen, have you seen, and I'll come to you next, Ismael, as well, but Helen, have you seen any particular introductions of different incentives that you feel have been quite effective?
Well, I think it's now becoming a lot more standard for senior executives' remuneration to be linked to the E, the S, and the G, very much so. But I mentioned our loan facility as well. I mean, it's core through all. It should be through all parts of the business. It's quite interesting, though. I think one we have to be a little bit careful of. TRIG is when we travel, we offset with our carbon footprint, because we haven't been traveling at all for the last 18 months, so we haven't been generating any carbon emissions on that. I think one has to be very careful for other companies who can be argued have suddenly seen the light and become green. And we have this problem of greenwashing. How green are they really? That I think we need to be very careful on, because I think some executives are being rewarded for going green in a part of the business when 80% of it is still very not green. And that is where we need to have more focus, and I think where investors need to have more focus. Great advantage for something like Trig, because investors flock into us because they know there's no greenwashing. Yeah. But other companies will find that more difficult, and I think that's where we need to hasten change, because there's an awful lot of industries, you know, you think of the big oil companies, yes, they're all becoming green, but they're still making a vast amount and most of their profits and their money on polluting substances. So that is where we need to have more change, I think, to really see a difference. Because, you know, all of us can do our bit at home, etc., but that's not going to save the planet, because we're very small, little pimples. We need the big majors to do things.
Yeah, Ismail.
Yeah, I think on that topic about what governments can do to incentivize or encourage, maybe looking at it the other way, I think it's known that the most powerful and efficient way to decarbonize companies is through carbon tax, and I would love to hear more from Emily from this as well. But you know, like according to a number of like studies, I think it's really a really powerful way to allow like firms and households to find low cost ways of reducing energy usage, but also shift towards cleaner alternatives. But I think in the UK, the carbon tax is a bit of a mess. I mean, I think for the same amount of energy, if someone was using lights and computers in their homes, they would pay like a tax of around like £40. But the same damage to the climate from heating their homes with heating oil comes with a charge of only £7. So it's a bit of a mess. And even if we look across industries, if we look at agriculture, which counts for 10% of, you know, the UK greenhouse gas emissions, it's essentially got negative carbon prices because of the subsidy to red diesel, which pays much lower duties than the diesel that motorists use. And there is this idea of like an effective carbon tax, I think often called like a carbon price of like £80 per ton, which is sort of the target that the government is going for. But I think the government can do more to sort this out and hit this target while evening the playing field, and not just going after like motorists, but aviation, agriculture, domestic gas use, etc.
Well, we haven't talked about the sort of tax and fiscal policies. Emily, do you want to comment on using that as a driver, an incentive?
Yeah, I mean, I think taxes are really important, really important, and getting it right is very important. And I think having a tax on carbon. So we have, as Ismail said, we have a very difficult setup in this country that hasn't, and in the EU through the emissions trading system, which hasn't been, well, it's been partly successful, but has had a load of different problems. And one of the things that I think governments could do, and the UK government could do in setting up its new emissions trading scheme, now that we're outside of the EU, is to make sure that, yeah, the carbon price is at a proper price. I think the EU emissions trading scheme, for a long time, the carbon price was around €4 to €5, instead of being around 50 as it was supposed to be at the time, and has had to have a lot of top-ups and taxes and carbon floors and lots of things to try and get this market to work sufficiently. And it's much better now. I think it's around 30 euros last time I checked. But there's still a real problem, and for me, a really significant problem is the free allocation of carbon credits through this system. Now, Total, the massive multinational fossil fuel company, gets around a third of its carbon credits allocated to it rather than having to pay for them, which I think is just, well, an insanity at this point. You know, in 20 or so years into the emissions trading scheme, that you can still be giving away free credits to fossil fuel companies, because this should be incorporated into the price of the product. You know, ultimately the price should be incorporated, and then that incentivizes, you know, actual technologies and activity and mechanisms to reduce those emissions, and to, you know, for others to sell their emission, their carbon credits that they don't use. Now, you know, there may be very many reasons why my approach is not the right approach, but I think in order to make sure that these taxes work correctly, they need to be rethought, and there needs to be a proper price on carbon. There has to be, for it to be this central mechanism that it's supposed to be in the EU response to climate change, alongside other different types of regulatory mechanism as well. But so I think it needs to be really addressed, and hopefully, you know, as more jurisdictions take up emissions trading and carbon taxes, then it can be you know, much more successful mechanism.
Yeah, it's a definitely important lever. Look, we're almost coming to the close of the panel, and just want to sort of thank everyone for all of the comments and the questions that have been coming through. There is obviously just one last question from me, and I also do want to go back to our illustrator to see how that picture has been evolving. But just one last question, I suppose. I think there's a sense of a huge amount of urgency, and a lot of the things that we've been talking about are things that have taken quite a lot of time to evolve, and require quite a lot of leadership to push things forward. So maybe just a question to all of you, as you know, in terms of a recommendation that you would, you know, put out there, if you like, you know, what would be your recommendation to boardrooms, or to government, in terms of really grappling with this urgency of how quickly we need to move to reduce emissions? So I'll come to you in the order that I kind of introduced you all. So Ismail, to you first.
Well, I haven't thought about what one key recommendation.
There's probably quite a few.
There's definitely quite a few. I think yeah, listening to your shareholders, I think, and on the flip side, as individuals, I think going to your companies, writing to your pension manager, joining groups like Share Action in the UK, there's so many things that individual can do in, you know, in all three: economy, politics, technology. Yeah, I think that's sort of what I would say.
Thank you. Emily.
So I guess, I'm focusing on the UK for this point because it has the piece of legislation, but I would say to impose the Climate Change Act and its net zero target onto private actors as well. I think that would be, given how rapid action needs to be taken, I think having a legal obligation to be net zero is necessary, personally.
Well, let's try and work on that one. Herman.
Three things, both for the private sector and the public sector. For the private sector, it is, for me, reduce, enable, and advocate. So reduce your own emissions. There's no excuse not to reduce your own emissions. You can do that yourself, pretty easy. Enable your supply chain to do the same. So work with your suppliers, work with your customers on renewable energy, renewable electricity. All these things are possible. Solar and wind are cheap, it's there. So why not? Advocate, start saying to policymakers that you want action, you want actually a carbon price, etc., and be part of those coalitions. Then for the public sector, I mean, the biggest thing is stop kicking the can down the road. I think that's the primary advice here, because we should have had a deal already in Kiev, or at least in Copenhagen, or even before that. But stop subsidizing fossil fuels. I mean, there's no excuse to keep on subsidizing fossil fuels. Two, have a comprehensive set of carbon pricing, both for private citizens, which should be aligned with also with income tax, because you can't raise prices on the one hand, but keep on charging 50% income taxes. At least it's in my country. I don't know what you guys are doing in Britain now. You have your freedom back. And thirdly, protect those who innovate. So make sure that the playing field for those who innovate is there, and that you're not being punished if you're the first one, but actually slightly rewarded, but definitely not punished.
Thank you, Herman. Really helpful reflections. And Helen, your recommendation?
Well, I think mine is for government. I mean, if you look at where we were, say, 10 years ago with renewables, there was hardly any. How come we've got so much renewables on the system and we're leading in offshore wind? It was through government support. And some of that was taken away for onshore wind. It's coming back. Where are the problems now? They're in heating, they're in transport. It's key that the government does something about electric vehicles. You're not going to have a step change if you've got issues with people can't charge, they can't charge on motorways, they haven't got range issues. It's just not going to be practical. At the moment, basically, only people who've got EVs are those who can afford to have 2 cars, frankly, and that's not on. We've got to do something about home heating as well, and the government has to get behind this, be it heat pumps or hydrogen or whatever. There doesn't seem to be a concerted effort. We are not going to get climate change under control just by building wind farms. So, and the government has to put money behind this. I think they should have learnt that from what they've done in the past. So that, I think, is my that will make a really big step change. Will this government do it? Well, we'll wait and see. But they talk a lot, but they haven't actually done very much so far. So let's keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah, well, then it comes back to using our voting power. Look, I'll ask Tom to share his screen as we're just closing, just kind of closing words. So Tom, please do show us your final illustration. It was great to sort of see you starting it. Thank you all so much for joining this panel. It's been really interesting, wide-ranging conversation, and it's just great to hear so many different perspectives on how we need to tackle this problem. So just thank you all very much for joining this panel. And thank you all to those of you who've listened in. We really do look forward to staying in touch with you all. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.